Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Anya Pichenina, and I am a program officer focusing on research translation work here at the Kauffman Foundation. Today, we will be examining the relationship between entrepreneurship and digital transformation. What is digital transformation, you might ask? Researchers define it as a process of reimagining business practices, culture, and customer experiences using digital technologies. The speed of digital transformation accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have seen businesses across sectors transforming their operational models to meet the changing world and to be responsive to the needs of both customers and employees. As this process continues to gain momentum, we wanted to spend some time thinking about what digitalization means for new businesses. How are entrepreneurs adapting to this new landscape? And who is most likely to benefit from this process? How can we ensure this transformation is equitable? And as a result, what are the potential policy implications of these findings? For this forum, we invited several researchers and practitioners to share with us what they are learning about digitalization and how it is impacting entrepreneurship. We have two exciting panels for you today. In our first panel, we will discuss what digital transformation means for entrepreneurship, what trends and changes are we observing in how people start and transform their businesses. And in our second panel, we will focus on issues of equity and inclusion in digital entrepreneurship and how can we ensure that we do not create new or exacerbate the existing barriers for traditionally marginalized communities. And how can digital transformation help us address the gaps and opportunities moving forward? After each panel, we will have a moderated Q&A, and I would encourage you to send in your questions into the chat box throughout the presentations. Our speakers today come from diverse backgrounds in research and practitioner sectors. I would like to thank each of today's participants for taking the time out of their very busy schedules to share their insights with us. And we host this forum to provide a platform for an in-depth discussion on how to solve problems. And the Kauffman Foundation does not take a political position or a legislative position on these discussions. So with that, I would like to turn our attention to our panel one moderator, Manav Raj.
Thank you so much, Anya. Really a pleasure to be here today and to be able to moderate this discussion. My name is Manav Raj. I am a fifth-year doctoral student at NYU Stern in the Department of Management and Organizations, and I will be an incoming professor at the Wharton School of Management starting in July. As someone who studies questions around how digital technologies affect firm strategy, I'm really excited to hear from our panelists today. So just without further ado, to introduce them, our first panelist is Dr. Sam Chow, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Business School. We have Dr. Luca Iandoli, who is the Associate Dean for Global Programs and Research at the Leslie H. and William L. Collins College of Professional Studies at St. John's University. We have Dr. Rachel Meltzer, who is the Plimpton Associate Professor of Planning and Urban Economics at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design in the Department of Urban Planning and Design. And we have Dr. Jin Yu, who is the Elizabeth M. and William C. Truhoff Professor in Entrepreneurship and Professor of Information Systems in the Department of Design and Innovation at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University, and who also has a secondary appointment as the WBS Distinguished Professor for the Research Environment at Warwick Business School. So very excited to hear from our panelists. And yeah, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Sam so she can get us started and we can get the ball rolling.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at the forum. I'm really honored to be able to share some perspectives with you around a topic that is dear to my heart. And I look forward to learning from many of you on this panel. Over the last 2 decades, there has been robust empirical evidence showing that the US economy has experienced a persistent decline in business dynamism. And this is reflected in different measures of firm creation and job churn rates. There were both less entry of high growth young firms and lower labor market fluidity across the country. During the same time, aggregate productivity growth has also declined substantially. And in contrast to these trends, technical advances in many types of digital technology seem to promise us a prosperous future as drivers of productivity. And some examples of such innovation include cloud computing, open source software, digital platforms, data-driven analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, just to name a few. Some companies are able to push the digital frontier and advance far ahead of other firms in terms of creating value and capturing value from weaving digital tech effectively into the various parts of the organization. At the same time, startup funding in these technology areas has been rising for many years. For example, the dollar amount of private investment into AI startups more than doubled in 2021 compared to 2020. The big puzzle is, how do we reconcile the fact that massive opportunities are facilitated by new digital technologies, but the overall productivity growth has been slowing despite all this amazing potential? And as Decker et al. Pointed out in a 2017 paper, the productivity slowdown cannot be explained by imperfect measurement alone, and it's also beyond simply being a technology problem. Declining dynamism is a crucial piece of the puzzle, and allocative efficiency, which is an important link between technical progress and firm value creation, has been lagging and limiting growth. For many years, when we appear to witness the great powers of promising digital tech. An accompanying trend is more inequality across firms, individuals, and places. For example, some firms benefit much more from adopting digital technology than others. My colleagues at Harvard Business School, others and myself included, have been looking into firm-level explanations of this phenomenon through the lens of organizational complements and ecosystems that support the incorporation of digital technology. The basic takeaway from some of our studies has been that digital technology by itself is not enough. And companies need to integrate digital technology in a seamless fashion into relevant parts of the organization. And that can prove to be very difficult because it requires complementary practices and supporting ecosystems that are not always present. And there are vast differences in how firms are structured and how business processes interact with existing IT infrastructure and software tools. Organizational complements that are conducive to new digital technology may not always exist, and they can be extremely challenging to build up due to demand for business continuity and architectural inertia. And in some of my own research, we look into companies' technological architecture as a crucial complement to a particular class of digital innovation, namely machine learning and predictive analytics. The central feature of this technology is that it involves deriving business insights from digitized information and handling data, usually large amounts of data that keeps accumulating in real time. To measure technological architecture, we use very detailed and meticulously run firm-level survey administered to technology executives within over 100 public companies. We specifically focus on two stages of the architecture around handling and using data, namely data platform and analytics architecture. And we find both stages to be important drivers of productivity benefits from machine learning adoption. When firms have relatively mature data platform and analytics architecture, they adopt more machine learning applications. We find that combining architectural capabilities with machine learning adoption leads to synergy and increased productivity gains at the firm level. And we also find that a crucial feature of mature data platform lies in its ability to integrate data sources from various business units and functions. And this leads to less fragmented machine learning adoption across establishments, and hence more coherence in the way that firms incorporate digital tech. And coherence proves to be crucial to driving economic gains from data-driven technology. Although our study focused on large incumbent firms, there are insights that are generally applicable to startups and incumbents alike. Startups face both advantages and disadvantages relative to large incumbents when it comes to realizing the synergy and productivity benefits from adopting digital technology. While entrepreneurial firms may have few users and little data to work with in the beginning, they may not have sufficient customer information to help optimize product and service delivery. However, there are third-party vendors, data markets, other tools that they can leverage to reach new users. Another option is to rely on large platforms and become complementors in a platform ecosystem to get started. On the other hand, startups might find adapting to technological innovation in their favor because startups tend to have small and lean teams and less inertia to begin with. They can choose specific technology stacks and external partners more flexibly, and agile teams can adapt to changes in external environment more swiftly. And for both incumbents and startups, data silos can occur and become a problem regardless of firm size. Stacking up new tech or migrating to cloud alone might not be enough for the needs of digital transformation, but designing technological architecture with an integration mindset is crucial to effectively incorporating data-related digital technologies. So I'll close with this. At the end of the day, startups should take the opportunity of being able to build from ground up to make particularly smart technology choices without having to compromise and work with complicated legacy systems like established incumbents have to. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sam. Really, really interesting presentation and really interesting to think about the architecture side of things. From here, we're going to hand off to Dr. Luca Iandoli. So Dr. Iandoli, please feel free to share your screen.
Okay, thanks a lot for having me. I hope you can see my screen. Really honored to be here and happy to contribute to this discussion. The topic I will focus on for this presentation is the topic of digital divide. This is something that I think we need to discuss more, especially, given the fast pace at which digitalization is advancing after the pandemic specifically. And there's a lot of startups and businesses that are struggling with it. So there are basically two ways to look at digital entrepreneurship, and they are both legitimate and useful depending on the context of discussion. The first one really has a focus on digital technology and digital industry. And this is not the one I'm going to refer to for this presentation. I'm more interested in the process of digital transformation of the entrepreneurial process and the process of new venture creation as we know it. This is more, maybe it's better to call this digitalized entrepreneurship. So the question is, one question is, recurring question is what's really new with this? Is what is really changing? I think there's many elements of novelty, and I'll go quick on a few ones that I'm sure you're familiar with. In general, we are questioning the man of the street narrative that digital entrepreneurship is about this breakthrough, disrupting innovation happening in industry operated by a few super individuals who are changing the world. There's actually a lot of digital entrepreneurship that is not so visible that takes place through digital platforms. Another element of novelty is the flexibility ensured by digital or hybrid business models for companies in terms of reconfiguring or redesigning their business models quickly. Even more interesting is the increasing reliance of entrepreneurs to the membership of different types of online communities and networks. But what I think it's really an element of novelty that maybe is less discussed is what I call the transformation of entrepreneurs into cyber entrepreneurs. The word cyber here has nothing to do with cybersecurity, although that's an important topic for small businesses as well and startups. It's more like in cyberpunk. So I borrowed this terminology from the definition of an anthropologist, Amber Case, who say that any technology really transforms us into cyborgs, meaning in plain terms that what technology does is to expand our human ability to do something or to adapt to the environment in a better way. So when it comes to entrepreneurship, there's a new and ever-growing availability of digital tools that are significantly expanding individual entrepreneurial skills and empowering human creativity while also reducing the barrier between ideation, invention, and innovation, and sometimes even creating accidental entrepreneurs, maker entrepreneurs that are kind of entering the scene in new ways. So to give you a more concrete idea what I'm talking about, this entrepreneurial technologies, that's how I call them, support entrepreneurs virtually in any step of the new venture creation process And here I've just passed a few logos, but there's new tools coming up every day. And this list here is not even particularly updated in reality, but it doesn't really matter. What it matters is that while the process basically stayed the same, what cyber entrepreneurs do, they walk this digital landscape and they combine these tools in different ways. And in doing that, they can basically reduce the learning rate. They can improve, the learning rate. They can reduce the risk of failure sensibly by learning more quickly. And the same applies also to funding. Also, the funding scene has been disrupted by digital technologies as well. So this is why I propose a new definition of digital entrepreneurship, like if we need another definition here, but I'm really focusing on the creation of digital value. So digital entrepreneurship is the process of entrepreneurial creation of digital value to a variety of digital enablers to support effective acquisition, processing, distribution, and consumption of digital information. In more practical terms, what I'm trying to say is that every company that is trying to digitalize has to deal with two different value chains. One is the core business value chain, and the other one is the digital value creation. And these two value chains might be more or less synergic, more or less aligned, can have different importance, different size, depending on the type of business as well. But they coexist, and they should be they should attract the attention of entrepreneurs altogether. To give you an idea what I'm talking about, let's go back in time a few years. So I remember this executive from Domino, the Domino Pizza, the company, saying this in one of my classes. I invited him as a guest speaker. And he said, people think we are a pizza company. In reality, we are an information technology company. And what I think, if I interpret these words to my little framework here, is like, Domino at that time realized that it could create much more value by engrossing its digital value creation, or on the top of what was, of course, its pizza business. So to be more specific about what I mean by digital value creation, here is another framework. This is the value chain. It's about acquiring information and digital fashion, processing it, distributing, and also let it be consumed by our customers and users. There are a few elements in this model as well. First of all, each step has its own digital information needs, and these, of course, are different from company to company. Then there's frictions between each step. So this process of moving information forward along the value chain is not smooth. And finally, there are digital enablers that are the technologies that we use to either fulfill the needs in each step or facilitate, or reduce the impact of frictions. So this is a very quick example, just to clarify some of this terminology. Think of a restaurant, and I pick a restaurant not only because it's a simple establishment, small company that maybe has never heard of digitalization before, but also because this type of business was one of those industries that was highly impacted by the pandemic, forced it to go digital soon and quickly. So, for instance, what is the type of information that a restaurant needs to acquire to generate the put online? What kind of enablers it can use? Maybe social media, maybe building websites, using website building suite. Of course, there are friction at the level of the skills. These examples are not exhaustive, of course. I'm just kind of fictional, but I think they are relevant. So the problem is, however, you need social media management skills, you need digital design skills. When it comes to processing, if you want to deliver part of your services in a digital way, you need digital infrastructure. And a company like this maybe can't build this infrastructure internally. So normally, however, today, unlike the time of Domino, there's many platforms that a company can affiliate with to compensate for that lack. When it comes to distributing, let's say that distributing and sharing is for marketing purposes. So there's an issue of digital user profiling, building a community of users and followers. And here there are, again, other enablers like digital marketing, web analytics, for instance, to name a few. But these are a little bit more complicated and more difficult to understand and use by a company like this, and so on and so forth. We can make other examples. What I want to contribute to this debate is really a reflection on the role of digital divide, and also a way to understand digital divide define it in a different way. Beyond the obvious aspects of a lack of access to technology or absence of digital literacy. I mean, these factors are still very important, but are less important because digital technology and skills are now more readily available, are more affordable. That's why I used the Domino example, because in those days you need a big company with a lot of resources to build a pizza monitor. Now even the ice cream parlor that is downstairs where I live here can have that through Seamless or other apps. So the problem is not so much the skills and tech that they need, but more importantly, what do they do with this digital tech and skills? And the framework that I suggest can be a way to understand more in depth what are the determinants of the difficulty of using to the full extent of their potential this technology and skills. Also, I think another contribution I'd like to offer for discussion is that we need to understand digital divide at the micro level a little bit better and be a little bit more impactful there to complement what is the great work that needs to be done also at the macro level and is being done when it comes to bigger things like regulation, infrastructure, and governance. So understanding digital divide at the level of an industry, at the level of even of a single company, is probably where we need a little bit more work to help these companies to really catch these opportunities. So there could be many questions, around this framework that could be supported by this framework, like what are the most important types of friction entrepreneurs have to deal with? What are the best technological enablers, especially in terms of affordability and usability for small businesses and very young startups, for instance, that are not necessarily natively digital, and what digital information needs are most critical for entrepreneurs, and more importantly, how much are they aware of these needs? Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to our discussion and any question on this topic.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Iandoli. Really also interesting to think about these digital enablers. And I study food delivery platforms myself, and thinking about how they can enable value capture and also generate these frictions you talk about is a really nice tension. With that, we are next moving on to Dr. Rachel Meltzer. So Dr. Meltzer, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. I'm going to pivot a little, but I think it's actually a pretty good segue off of what Luca just presented. So I'm going to be talking about some research today that's in very early stages. So I actually probably have more questions than answers right now. It's work with my colleague Leah Brooks at George Washington University, and it's actually supported by Kauffman's Knowledge Challenge Grant. And we are at the beginning stages of trying to figure some of this stuff out. So I'm going to be talking about place-based entrepreneurship, and I'll define that a little more specifically in a minute, and how it's interfacing with the proliferation of e-commerce. So we approach this this issue or this topic with the understanding that e-commerce, right, is a phenomenon that pretty much transcends space, right? That's an important important feature. And that's at the kind of opposite end of the spectrum of place-based businesses, or the kinds of entities that really rely on the location where they operate. And specifically, we're going to be looking at retail and customer-facing retail. So again, operations that really are on the ground there, and their business model is very much based on being there on the street and interfacing with those customers. And so very much about place and space, unlike e-commerce. And the value of place and location for these kinds of businesses is particularly important in the context of urban metro areas, which are denser, and the whole kind of fundamentals of cities are around the proximity and the co-location of these kinds of activities. And so we look at e-commerce as a disruption in this kind of fundamental way that those markets operate, and we really want to understand what the implications are for those entities on the ground. I probably don't need to convince many of you of this, but this is an important thing to know, right? Retail businesses are important for a lot of reasons. They're important for those businesses themselves because they're often sources of livelihood. They are employers, right? Especially a lot of these are smaller businesses, employing a number of people, providing amenities, cultural, leisure to cities and places, but also providing some really important services and necessity goods and services to people in communities. And they're also anchors of a lot of places and neighborhoods. So for a lot of reasons, we should understand what happens when they come up against a shock like e-commerce in their operations. So this is data from the census, just to again give you a sense of how things have changed over time. The top line is retail sales overall, growing kind of over time, flattening somewhat as time goes on. And the bottom line are sales attributed to e-commerce transactions. It's hard to tell from this picture, but actually pretty consistently over the past couple decades, the year-on-year growth in those online sales has been double or triple what we're seeing in the overall retail industry. And so e-commerce is growing, it's not going away. And so it's a big and growing share of this retail market. So I'm just show you a few slides here. Again, these actually, the next ones are out of organization JP Morgan Chase Institute. They've done actually a lot of good work on the interface between offline and online commerce. They have some good data to work with, just again to set up the problem, right? And then I'll get into a little bit of how we think we're going to approach it. So here, a couple takeaways from this image here is number one, on the right-hand side there, on one side, you see the online, again, proliferation, both from they were kind of pegging this to certain localities. So both entities that are owned locally and nationally are growing, right, in the online space. So to kind of reinforce that point. But what's interesting is on the other side, you see that any growth in the offline or brick and mortar space is really coming out of the local, smaller businesses, right, the kind of entrepreneurial space. And so telling us this still resonates. They're putting up a fight, right, against this larger growth, but the discrepancies there are stark. Some more, so, and I should say the one before was a pre-COVID kind of snapshot. Now this is post-COVID. So they've done some analysis to understand how these kinds of commerce have shifted since COVID, and not surprisingly, right, the blue lines are the offline, the kind of in-person commerce, green lines are online, and we see a lot of positive upward facing green lines suggesting that across different settings, across different cities, that space is growing. We might see it kind of recede a little, but there's some thinking that COVID just accelerated some of these patterns that we were going to see anyway, but definitely some variation across setting and place. And variation across the kinds of services and goods, right? So groceries really turning to online, but other things like clothing and personal care, not as much of a disparity between the offline and online changes. So already we can see that there's a lot of, there's a difference, right? So there's some, disparity that we should understand, but there's variation across place, across the type of industry. And even those numbers I showed you are at a scale that's probably too large to even understand really what's going on. So what we're gonna do is dig even deeper on the ground, be able to observe some of this at the neighborhood level, the city level. And the main question that's kind of driving this inquiry is really, is e-commerce a substitute or a complement for offline brick and mortar retail? And we can't formalize this in this way. For those of you familiar with kind of consumer theory, kind of some of the fundamentals of urban economics and how kind of consumers choose where they consume their goods and services, it comes down to two calculations, right? The costliness of the search for those goods and services, and the costliness of the transport, getting to either by distance or cost to access those goods and services. And consumers are going to want to probably minimize the costs for both. On the other side, the retail enterprises, the operators of these businesses, right, are going to locate in places where they can benefit from being close to other kinds of entities, and that might be by being close to other ones that are similar in the goods and services they provide, to kind of create some beneficial, competition or complementary, right? The butcher shop next to the dairy store, that co-location can benefit every entity. And they want to also be close to their consumers, right? So this is what was the underpinning of a lot of both the kind of business location and also the consumer choice theories. And what the internet has done, what e-commerce has done, has essentially reduced to zero a lot of these costs for people, right? Search costs go down because you have these platforms that expedite looking for that, that match between what you need and where you are. And transfer costs are essentially down to zero, right? If you can get this good and service to your door. So this is a major disruption to how these businesses operate, and actually getting back to the place, right? How cities operate and how they rely on the physical presence of these entities. So what this might mean is that the co-location of certain goods and services matters less, and the co-location of consumers and those goods and services matters less. So these are the kinds of hypotheses that we are going to be testing directly. But the reason why this is an empirical question, right, why this is kind of theoretically ambiguous, is there are exceptions to this. We still have a lot of goods and services that are very experiential that the internet has not been able to replicate as well. And so are those kinds of entities the ones that are going to fare better in the face of this disruption? We also know that there's other positive spillovers from having brick and mortar retail activity. One clear implication is safety, right? There's evidence to show that more eyes on the street, more activity on the street just can help with creating safer communities. And then, which is kind of brought up in the previous presentations, this idea of bricks and clicks, that there are ways for businesses to adapt and find this middle ground between offline brick and mortar presence and then also maybe benefiting from an online space. So all these things might actually mitigate some of those negative disruptions. So the way that we're going to approach this, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards about the details, but right now we're in the process of putting together a pretty massive data set on establishments and retail leases across the US. We're going to be able to drill down to the neighborhood scale, the city scale, to understand what's happening in a pretty micro way, and then compare across settings in different cities. And most importantly, we're going to observe this over time. We have decades of data going back even before the emergence of Amazon and the major e-commerce entities, so that we can really start to pin down some before and after causality. We're interested in looking at things like vacancies, right? The kind of extreme response to this disruption and how persistent they are, how spatially concentrated they are. This is an important implication for cities and neighborhoods and the businesses themselves. Clustering, has this changed the spatial organization of these entities? What does that mean for the businesses themselves and their ability to thrive? And what does that also mean for communities and the kind of ecosystem of cities? And then finally, we're going to be able to observe how the fundamentals of specifically urban metro markets are responding. Are we seeing this shift reflected in the prices of land and space? And then are governments then responding in turn and changing their land use regulations and regimes to this shift in how people are consuming services and providing them? So I'll just end just on, just to reinforce why this matters, or in the end, what hopefully we'll be able to say. So especially for the kinds of businesses I've been talking about, place matters, right? It matters where they operate. A lot of the models are designed to serve certain communities and markets. And when those shift, it really impacts the business tremendously. But businesses are really important for those places too. So there's this mutual kind of benefit from figuring this out and trying to find a place where both can navigate this. There hasn't just been a documentation of this. So this is our first step, is just lay out the landscape. And then, as I said, be able to tease out a clear cause and effect story, especially for policy design. I just want to mention one example that comes up in my world a lot of conversation around the vulnerability of small businesses in the face of things of neighborhood change, like gentrification. What I get concerned about is, I think a lot of that is often confounded with these broader trends of e-commerce. And so if we're attributing some of the troubles to gentrification, when in fact the root is more this online competition, we've misidentified a problem, and therefore the solution is not going to be effective. So we really need to tease out what's cause and effect here. And then, as I alluded to before, important variation that will matter just in designing responses. Are there certain subsectors that, again, might be able to navigate this more effectively, and does place matter, and in what way? What characteristics of neighborhoods and places might make it more, make them more resilient, right, in the face of this disruption and the businesses that operate there?
Thank you so much, Dr. Meltzer. Finally, the last presenter that we have is Dr. Jin Yu. So Dr. Yu, floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you. Good morning. It's my pleasure and honor to be part of this the panel. So I don't have a slides, but I will just share some of my thoughts. Before I begin, I've been working on digital innovation, digital transformation last 20 plus years, and looking at this from the angle of information systems and business model perspective. What I'd like to share is that, how the field has changed over the last 20 years, what we know, and where we are moving toward in terms of some of the new challenges that is coming up. So, and then I'm going to preface by saying that I will not focus on the role of digital technology in the process of traditional entrepreneurship, like funding and the processes and so on, but more focusing on the digital entrepreneurship itself, the companies who are actually using digital technology. With the qualification, I don't believe that the digital entrepreneurship is focusing only on digital technology field. I think it is going everywhere. So I think that distinction needs to be made. So what do we know? I think we know now that digital entrepreneurship is quite different. Number one, it is different from the traditional high growth tech-based entrepreneurship, in the sense that it does not require PhDs and university investments or patents, in a way that it is very low entry barrier business. Anyone who has a laptop and being able to code can enter into. On the other hand, unlike a traditional lifestyle entrepreneurship, it actually has high growth potential. So in a way, it has both goods and bads of, in these different kinds of entrepreneurship. The other, I think, interesting thing is that there are very few who actually succeed. But on the other hand, those who succeed have demonstrated that they could grow really, really big in a global scale, what I would label as a $1 trillion formula. So they know how to create sustainable growth. They know how to capture values. And it is around what I would call a digital value loop. So it is similar to value chain, but it is not a chain, linear chain, but it is a loop that recurs and going around and around specific individual needs of users. So big distinction is customer as a buyer and customer as a users. Market share doesn't really matter. It is engagement, the ongoing recurring engagement with specific users. So these are some of the things that we learned over the last 20 years or so by looking at digital firms. So where are we now in moving forward? The first thing I would say is the easy stuff in terms of digital innovation has been done. What I mean by easy stuff is that digital innovation that happens within flat screen, the value creation and value capture all happens within a confined space of screen, whether it is big screen or small screen, has been done. So, and that's shown in the chart that Rachel shows in the e-commerce. As much as we have heard the explosive growth of e-commerce, we still live in physical world. People still consume a lot of food, and we actually eat. So you cannot really create and capture value entirely on flat screen. So what is left actually is a digital coming out of the flat screen and moving into the physical world. And the rude awakening is that physical world is not friction free. There's a lot of challenges. And I think that is main challenges that we are looking at. So moving into the physical world, understanding the importance of locations and importance of the physical products and how we mobilize those products, understanding the actual logistics. These are not an easy problem to solve, and so that will be the next frontier of digital entrepreneurship. The second one is that if you look at last 15 years or so of Silicon Valley-based digital startups, they are very, very good at creating value, but they are not necessarily good at capturing value. As we have seen examples of Uber or WeWork, some of these are like high-profile failures. They are not necessarily failed to create value for end users. They provide pretty good products and services to the end users. What they have not done is a demonstrating ability to actually make money in a sustainable way. This is something that many companies are struggling still. And also, a lot of corporate ventures, digital ventures are also struggling with this. So I think this is another area where I think we're going to see a lot of challenges. Third challenge that I think we're going to see is that the companies are now moving into high growth opportunities. What is left is highly regulated areas, transportation, finance, and healthcare. So moving into these areas is quite different than doing retail and e-commerce and so forth. So these digital startups are confronting the regulatory regimes that are entrenched in our institutional practices. So how do you dislodge these institutional patterns of actions and beliefs and norms through these small startups who are trying to challenge this? So some of the things that we learn is that successful digital entrepreneurs in these highly regulated areas are not necessarily trying to disrupt right out of the gate, but rather co-opt existing institutional practices so that they could survive and coexist, and eventually they might completely dislodge or change the way the institution behaves. You could see that the changes in the financial industry, where slowly the regulatory regimes are changing their behaviors toward decentralized DeFi, for example. Some of the key issues that we will see is the privacies and ethics and these challenges. Now, I think what we are seeing now is that some of the digital entrepreneurs are looking at issues around these regulatory issues, ethics and ownerships and so on, not as a constraint, but as an opportunity by creating new technologies that actually deal with these issues. And last point that I'd like to make briefly is that even before this war in Ukraine, we have seen the fractures of global digital infrastructures. I think we'll see a regional super scale platforms, and we're going to see more and more regionalized digital entrepreneurship activities. The days of like a super global digital platforms may be over or may be limited. So those are the points that I'd like to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yu, and thank you so much to all our presenters. These were a really great set of presentations and exposed us to a lot of different ideas around what digital entrepreneurship can be. So what I'd like to do now is invite the panelists to put their cameras on, join us, I guess, at the front, and we can go through answering some of the questions that the audience members put in during the chat. So to start, and Dr. Yu, you mentioned this at the end of your presentation around the current crisis in Ukraine and how that we're seeing fractures in some of these digital infrastructure. We received a question kind of specifically about Ukraine, but also thinking about COVID. So I kind of want to lump them together and ask you guys how you think about thinking about how these current events are going on, how they may disrupt and blur the lines between what we think about in terms of online versus offline entrepreneurship, and whether they serve as threats and how they may change kind of the trajectory of digital entrepreneurship. So I'll open that up to any one of you who feels that they have any thoughts on this.
I may jump in just very briefly. So one of the things that we have noticed is that global supply chain disruption, right? And Singapore is one of the largest port, and they have this very advanced what we call TradeNet. It is one of the most successful enterprise system that process customs and port clearance of the goods that these big container ships are processing. What they have learned is that it just is not flexible enough to deal with these disruptions. The big container ships cannot change their destinations and so on. So a lot of the global supply chain companies are actually changing the logistics, like they're looking for shorter routes, smaller ships, and so on. But then the technology that supports this, like the custom clearance, is not designed to deal with highly agile, flexible routes and changes. And so now they are trying to move into much more flexible infrastructure, peer-to-peer. These are opening up a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs. So again, I think there is an opportunity for companies who pay attention to what is changing in the a geopolitical sense and what happens. I think there are an opportunity to think about it. So just in the global transportation sense.
Great. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I have, again, coming from a different angle, a different perspective. I think, and particularly related to COVID, I do think that my guess is there will be some persistence in the change of kind of live work, right? Just the mobility of people. I think especially in cities and metro areas, that otherwise relied on, not as close a tie maybe between where people live and work for a certain class. Again, I think of people working. So this presents, a challenge, but also maybe an opportunity, from an entrepreneurial perspective of the value of place, I think, is going to change. And maybe it's just about where that place is. You can imagine that cities end up changing from these, places that with a few nodes that people move to work to, with like more nodes, right, where people are living and they're there more time because maybe they're not in the office as much. And so I think, again, the interface between what happens in person and what happens online is going to shift. I can't say I have predictions about, how much, exactly what that will look like, but I do think, especially if you're in the space of service provision, in that space, I would say be good to keep an eye on that and think about how people are thinking, how localized they're going to look for those services versus the things that are just going to be more sustainable online, because they can, meet the more dispersed way that people might be, kind of locating and operating their lives. So I just think the spatial organization of like work life is going to shift. And I think therefore from the kind of service provider sector, going to have to rethink how that matches the needs of consumers.
Great, thank you guys. One of the other interesting questions that we got from the panel was regarding the structure of the digital value chain versus what we consider as more traditional value chains. So the question was asking if it's tempting to communicate the digital value chain as more linear, which is, generally how people tend to view a traditional non-digital model. And the audience member who put in this question noted that the digital value chain may have a more diverse spread with nonlinear interconnections. And I was curious to hear what panelists thought about what this value chain may look like and how it may compare.
Yeah, I mentioned that in my presentation, and maybe the visual that I used gave that impression that it is linear, but it's actually not. Actually, one of the main traits of novelty that I think are evident with the digital entrepreneurship is that linear model can be walked through in so many different ways. One way is not linear is because all of these tools and digital information in general is highly scalable. So what you can do, you can start explore, and you can explore by minimizing also your risk of failure, because increasingly the amount of resources and time that you have to invest into exploring, for instance, a new type of customers or new type of market is way less than it was in the past, thanks to this flexibility. But this also means that another thing behind digital divide is also to break that type of mindset in which approaching, for instance, a new market is a linear thing. In fact, that's what we teach now in a lot of schools when it comes to entrepreneurship is things like design thinking or customer discovery, which have a lot of iteration. And it's all about, okay, start small, scale, fail cheap, fail fast, go back, revise, and there's nothing linear with that. What is linear at the micro level is the steps are the same, but then you have to go back and redo it again anytime you understand that you're not on the right path.
So just one quick point. I think the traditional sort of value discussion divides exchange value and use value. So creation of exchange value ends with the value chain at the moment of exchange of goods, and then the ownership of the property is transferred to the buyer. With the digital products, the creation of the moment of exchange value and use value is blurry, because because of the nature of computation, it is always runtime. So when you produce a digital product on your phone, on your tablet, that creation of exchange value occurs precise the moment of use, or almost near a point of use. And what that also means is that firms do not 100% in almost all cases, as long as they are using service-oriented architecture and cloud-based infrastructure, the ownership of the properties, the assets that are used in creation of value is retained by the firm. So this is co-creative actions. It's different from service. I mean, a lot of people talking about co-creation where customers is more integrating resources that they own. This is a true co-creation between the firm and the user. Now that gives firms ability to claim legal and economic claim to extract value on an ongoing basis in each and every time the user is using the product. This is very, very different than the value chain where the linear transaction ends with the transfer of all the ownership assets, right? So this is a very important economic sort of a rationale behind the huge valuation of the digital platforms when they are successful, because of property ownership and then the ability to extract residual value of the assets that they continue to own.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you guys, it seems like as we've talked to this panel, there's some really interesting questions that keep coming up around this idea of value co-creation or creation and value capture again, and that where these different elements come into play. I would love to continue going, but I'm looking at the clock on my end, and I think we're hitting 11:55, which is when I was told that we should be wrapping up. So I want to thank all of our panelists again, Dr. Yu, Dr. Xiao, Dr. Meltzer, Dr. Iandoli. It's been a real pleasure to hear your presentations, and it's great to get your thoughts.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
We're going to go ahead and kick off panel 2 here in just a moment. Just want to say thank you one more time to everyone from the first panel. That was awesome. And I feel like we had a great introduction to kind of getting kicked off with the second part of this discussion. That will be, I think, a great addition to what was already discussed. But we're going to kind of turn the discussion in a little different direction as far as digital transformation and take it over to looking at DEI. So I would ask that all of the panelists that are going to be joining me just get ready. I'm going to be calling on you here shortly. And otherwise, we are going to go ahead and get started. So our second panel is going to be discussing the topic entrepreneurship for all. And we're going to be discussing digital entrepreneurship, equity, and inclusion. And I am going to probably be referring to the equity inclusion part in DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a pretty common term that you'll see used in the business space to kind of sum up this area. And we're going to kind of talk about how that moves into digital entrepreneurship. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides prepared actually to get this discussion kicked off. And I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to introduce the members of my panel as well. All righty. So really looking at digital entrepreneurship and this concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I am Dr. Angel Durr, and I'll be moderating this panel. I'm a digital information leader. That's kind of how I'm using the language now, because I work in data, AI, ML, automation. And so at this point, it's really just about digital information in that space. And I work with it in a variety of different verticals for both for-profit and nonprofit purposes. I'm a consultant, PhD, so I also teach in this area as well, and I'm an entrepreneur. So I work in digital transformation, really, and I help organizations both on the for-profit and more of the NGO side with approaching that in a way that is strategic and efficient, and is really thinking not only about the present, but where things will kind of be going moving forward. And so with that in mind, I actually had a 100% online, so virtual, for-profit and nonprofit before COVID. So as a person of color, that's pretty unique. And so I was asked to come speak and be the moderator and share a little bit of my background, but also shed light on some of this areas of this topic with some of our panelists who also work in very similar capacities and are also coming at this from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. As a Afro-Latina working in the data, AI, ML space, I'm sure you can imagine there's not that many of us to begin with. So this is a topic that I often end up talking about because it is very, very important to me that we think about digital transformation and how this can really both create equitable opportunities and also have the potential to create some ethical situations for us as well. So please connect with me if you would like to learn more about what I do as well after this session, or if you have any questions or anything about that. But I want to take a moment to let our panel members introduce themselves. So I will ask that you each share your camera and just give an introduction to who you are and what this topic kind of means for you and your capacity within your organization and your role. We have individuals that are working with very diverse marginalized groups, and so their view of this topic will be very important as far as really understanding how DE&I applies to this specific topic that we've been discussing. So Kelly, I'll ask for you to share your video and give a little bit of information about who you are.
Thank you, Dr. Durr. Hello, everybody. I am Kelly Burton. I am the CEO of Black Innovation Alliance. I'm also the founder of Founders of Color. And so I would say over the course of the last 6 to 8 years, my work, my professional career has very much been dedicated to helping entrepreneurs of color to scale their business. And now at a systems level, working with ecosystem leaders and folks running ESOs and ISOs to build the sort of ecosystem that is necessary for Black innovators to thrive. I'm excited to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask Dr. Traci Morris to introduce herself as well and share anything she'd like to share about the topic as well, just as we kick things off.
Chukma, Hachi Chokmata, Sahulchafoat Aliche Traci Morris, and Chokachafa, Hulchafoat, Inkoni Homa Chikashasea. Hello, my name is Dr. Traci Morris, and I'm a member of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. I just introduced myself in Chickasaw and basically said my Chickasaw name in Coneyahoma, which is Panther Woman. Today I'm on Autumn Land, and I want to acknowledge their sovereignty as Indigenous people. So I'm in the Phoenix area. So I'm the executive director of the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University, and we're part of the Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. So this means that we are a non-teaching research institute in the university, and my area of specialty and our area of specialty at the institute is in tribal broadband, the digital divide, digital equity, and digital inclusion. And so I've been working in this space for a long time now. In fact, I've co-authored the only 2 studies, independent studies that exist about this subject. So I'm going to talk a bit about that today and about how it's different on tribal lands and such. But you know, some of the stuff I've authored, you can see on our website. So I'm not going to go into that. But the tribal space is a very different space, and I look forward to telling you what's going on and some of the exciting things that are happening. Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome. And then we also have Jake Foreman, who is joining us as well. Could we get you to give us an introduction also?
Sure. Hi ho, mabuhay. My name's Henry Jake Foreman. I'm absentee Shawnee from Oklahoma as well as Filipino and Scots-Irish. Born and raised here in Tiwa Territory, aka Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I'm a program director at the New Mexico Community Capital. We've been around since 2004. We started as a venture capital fund to really invest in Native American entrepreneurs. And at the time, we couldn't find those investment-ready businesses. So we decided, hey, you know what? We need to grow our own. So we started different programs like our Native Entrepreneur in Residence program that provided one-on-one mentorship, as well as direct cash assistance. And we've been doing this now for over 15 years, and it's something that we're continuing. And we really got interested in addressing this digital divide right before the pandemic, and specifically as it relates to financial literacy and building businesses that work for our Native people. So I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm really happy to share around this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome. Great introductions, everyone. And just to kind of kick things off, I have just a few slides I'm going to be sharing some data points that I think will kind of shed light on the complexity of this issue as we're talking about the digital divide and where we are now in terms of equity and inclusion as it relates to the digital landscape. So I'm going to share my screen once more. So as we're thinking about this space and what's going on in the world around us and the world that we've kind of come into post-COVID, the World Economic Foundation has kind of stepped up and said that they really want to create this call to action for social entrepreneurs to enter this space as it stands, and really look at areas where it relates to equity and inclusion and diversity, and how we can ensure that in this post-COVID landscape, things are provided to the people who need them most, and things are not, left by the wayside within these different groups. And so we're seeing a lot of organizations pop up to try to meet this need, because during COVID, it was exposed that we really do have this deep digital divide, as we were creating opportunities for a lot of us, myself included, to work remotely, and for the first time, we also saw that there were a lot of people that were not able to really compete in this landscape. I myself found out that just within my area, and I live in Dallas, Texas, for me to be an African-American person working online was very rare, even during COVID. Over 70% of us were still working in face-to-face capacities. And so that in itself is a little illuminating, but just 60% of adults are lacking the digital skills required to really work online. And that in itself, I think, says a lot about where we are, because we've been moving all of these critical services to the digital sector. And I don't think there's necessarily thought going into the people necessarily that are going without, or the people, it's not just not having, things like internet, but what if your internet isn't fast or isn't reliable? Those sorts of things also come into play. Within my own neighborhood, I work in a, major metropolitan city. Like the fastest internet I had access to was, not that great. And it's because I believe it's because I live in a predominantly minority part of the city. And those kinds of things, having unequal access to the same types of internet providers is itself another type of digital divide that we're looking at also. And I think this quote from the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction kind of sums it up pretty well, which is disasters amplify the inequitable aspects of the world we live in. And I'm pretty sure that most of our panelists would probably agree with that statement, that a lot of what we've seen during this post-COVID environment is, really just amplifying the inequalities that have existed for quite some time, if not, over 100 years, but we're now just really seeing the impact of them. And we're also seeing a worsening gender wage gap, where we're seeing women being kind of left out and leaving the job market, and the same time that we're seeing more women attend university than ever. So it's this weird dichotomy that's existing where women are prepared, they have the skills assumably, but they're not necessarily being given the opportunities, or maybe they don't have the same access to opportunities, or maybe it's just the fact that a lot of them are balancing motherhood with their careers. And I know myself, that's a challenge. And I work in a digital industry, and you'd think that they would understand, that they more than others, but it's no better in my space than it is in other spaces. In fact, it's probably worse because it's very male dominated in the data, AI, and ML space. But this inequality that's really been created from COVID only took a few months to create, but they're saying that it's going to take at least a decade to kind of fix the inequalities that were created during COVID, while at the same time we're seeing the wealthiest members of our society get even wealthier. So you're creating this, sort of tension in society as well between those who have and those who used to have and now are going without. And then within organizations themselves, which we're going to talk a little bit about that concept also within the organization, we're seeing a lot of organizations talking about diversity and inclusion, especially, after a lot of social justice movements kind of sprang up in the COVID landscape. But we're seeing that even though that those topics are being addressed within organizations themselves, they're not really translating to people feeling like they're actually included necessarily. And there's a difference between diversity and actually inclusion, which is why we talk about both of them as well when we're talking about equity. And then when we think about other marginalized groups like people with disabilities as well, we're seeing, huge increase in the number of individuals who are now disabled. And so that in itself has created a lot of inequalities that, again, were exacerbated really by COVID. So I want to now take some time to bring in our panelists and give them a chance to kind of talk about this topic and share a bit more about their experiences as it relates to, equality for equity for all in this new digital landscape. So for each of you, I'd just like for you to, I'm gonna stop sharing. I'd like for you each to kind of share a little bit of how equity has kind of been impacted by COVID, and how your organization is kind of managing those changes within this landscape, this very changing landscape that we have all around us. So we're just going to kick it off with you kind of sharing a bit about what this kind of equity and inclusion means within your organization specifically. So Dr. Traci, would you like to kick it off by sharing a little bit more?
Sure. So we don't really work in equity and inclusion per se the way that you're presenting it. So we work specifically on behalf of tribal nations. The research and the policy work that we do is on behalf of the 574 federally recognized tribes. And so, I guess I don't know how to translate that question. So, I mean, obviously there was inequities. I mean, we died because there was no connections. Okay, we don't even have baseline data of how connected Indian country is or was before, let alone after. So that is a huge issue. There's only two independent studies that have ever been done, and I authored both of those on connectivity in tribal lands. So, and that everything else is carrier reported data. So when you start looking at that, the digital inequities that existed before was obviously exacerbated as it was in other communities. But I think that in Indian country, we become the canary in the coal mine because of that. So what we saw at the university, so as the only research institute in the nation that's doing this kind of research on broadband and access in tribal lands, it was, gosh, there's no adjectives, I don't think, to describe how 2020 was. You're literally watching people die at the same time as you're working harder than you've ever worked to create data and to create policy recommendations and to get data to lawmakers about what little connectivity there is. So I think those are the sort of issues we worked on. I mean, we did do a little bit with some internal task forces for our students because we do have the largest population of Native students in the nation. So we did do some on the ground work because it happened during spring break. So, we had to call all of the students and such because, our university was like, oh, well, we emailed all the students and they said they're connected. Think about that. We emailed all the students and they said they're connected. Okay, yeah. They didn't even get that when we explained it. But I mean, also explaining the data to the university and to so many people about the lack of data and what that means in Indian countries. So that's why we're seeing a $2 billion investment on broadband in tribal lands specific to tribes because of our federal status. So although that's probably not enough, we estimate about 8 billion would be needed to get us on par with what exists right now. So those are the kind of things we saw. I think it's really hard to put into words in a simple question what it was really like. I'll just say, I'll stop you after this. I'll just say, when you're on a call and the tribal, the leaders, the men that are leaders are crying, it's bad.
Oh, I'm going to follow up on that because that's really, I'm still processing really like the trauma. Like we literally just lost someone from COVID just this past week, so this is, and I'll say this too, we're also just connected someone to Starlink just last week, the first time getting internet access. So this is real time what's going on. In 2018, we really wanted to see, how we could improve financial literacy and just financial economic well-being for Indigenous entrepreneurs and specifically families with children under the age of 7. So what we decided is that we needed to give everyone a laptop because we saw that access is not there. So we gave people a laptop, $1,200, just like our federal government gave them. But then we also gave them training, 20 hours of training and one-on-one assistance. And that model helped us through the pandemic because once the pandemic hit, we didn't stop working. We actually we even grew that work to make sure that everyone had laptops. And we heard it from people like, this is how I was able to pay my bills. This is how I was able to get my kids to school. This is how I was able to start my e-commerce, business online. So we know that access is a real issue, literally having a computer and a laptop and training around it. We were able to connect with big technology partners like Google. I just want to share that. My transformation, just like you, this has been years in the making to just tell people, we have a digital divide. We need to address this, right? I went to Google and said, hey, you all, have less than 1% Native Americans working for you, right? How can we address this digital divide? And a representative from Google said, well, you all don't offer computer science classes, in high school. So I don't know how we're going to be able to address that. That was not a sufficient answer for me, So we had to go in, and I call it big game hunting, because we had to go out of our comfort zones and be on these types of calls and be like, hey, like we're really suffering here. Is there anything that you all can do to help? And thank goodness we have some amazing people out there that are kind and compassionate and understanding and willing to support. So we did see large influxes of resources, right, into our communities. But that doesn't solve the problem that we're facing, right? We need to train people on the ground. We need to create value of what technology can provide us. And I just wanted to share a couple things. We've seen new forms of value creation, right? I'll just say this. So USD money out the window, right? I myself bartered a bicycle for toilet paper and groceries at one point. And that's what we're going back to. A lot of other indigenous entrepreneurs said, hey, you know what? Let's go back to bartership like we did in the past. Let's support one another. I think it also shared new forms of governance, right? That we could have a shared governance structure. And I think a lot of people are talking about that. What can we do if we're getting this large influx of money? How can we redistribute those resources equitably, right? So using tools like a Google Doc, right, really helps that. Hey, say, hey, let's put these proposals together in collaboration. I think, yeah, and really, you know, the biggest thing is I've seen increased opportunities for our entrepreneurs to be able to be on these national calls or even international calls, share about their stories, create new kind of, I guess, you know, sales channels, increase their business. And I think the last thing I just want to share is that everything that's new under the sun, I think, has been done in the past. So new forms of technology like blockchain, like, you know, I'm pointing to my wampum. We've done this before, right? So a lot of the innovation that we're seeing in technology is actually based off of indigenous innovation from the past. So I'll leave it there.
I definitely wanted to pop back in and just say that following up on that, one of the biggest issues that's thinking about the panelists before is, you know, we don't have data. That is the biggest issue. We're never going to be able to quantify what happened because there was no data before, and there's not data now, and there's not people collecting that data. So when we have funders come to us or folks that are new into the space and want to help and say, oh, well, can you just tell us the tribes that need the most help, or can you tell us where they are? You know what, that data doesn't exist. There is no baseline data that's comprehensive. And so what little we do have, you know, we're looking at, you know, we found that 33% of our respondents in our study are relying on cell phone connections. Well, and I know you're gonna agree with me, Henry. And so think about trying to do homework on your cell phone. We heard stories about writing papers on their phones. We heard think about the entrepreneurs. They're not building websites with content and, you know, e-commerce sites on their phone. They're selling on Instagram. When they get connection, they don't always have connection. When we're talking that, you know, 63% of tribal lands have broadband access. 63%, and that's a lower 48. That didn't include Alaska. There's 200 tribes in Alaska. So if we can't quantify this, we can't solve this. And we can't, and the thing, and to Henry's discussion, we can't even quantify the entrepreneurship. I've worked in that space as well. And we can't even begin to quantify tribal entrepreneurs. And we don't call ourselves that, let's be real. You say that word, that folks are going to say, I'm not an entrepreneur. I just sell some stuff, or I make some stuff, or whatever. That's just not how we roll, but we've been doing it forever. It's like Henry says. So if we don't get some scholars quantifying this data, I know it's not sexy yet, like health or education or law in our communities when they go to college, but we have got to have folks quantifying entrepreneurship and access. We've got to have more folks quantifying what's happening in broadband access, availability, use, and such. If we don't have those pipelines, we're never going to be able to solve the divide.
So just going off of that, Kelly, would you like to share a little bit about what the digital divide means within your role at your organization and the work that you do as well?
So when I think about the topic of the conversation today, entrepreneurship for all ? it really triggers this piece around accessibility, the extent to which entrepreneurship is accessible to all people. And I think it's an important question, and the answer is very much a mixed bag. When we think about business starts, how easy it is for anyone to start a business, we know that people of color are actually outperforming in that area. And so Latinx folks are 50% more likely to start a business than the rest of the population. We think about the businesses started by women, 7 to 8 out of 10 of the businesses started by women are started by women of color these days. And Black women are the fastest growing demographic of entrepreneurs in the country. So yes, people of color are starting businesses at a rapid clip. Unfortunately, those businesses are not growing on pace with our white counterparts. Currently, white-led firms generate about 10 times the revenue of Black firms, 8 times the revenue of Latinx firms. And while 82% of businesses have no employees, all businesses, when we look at the Latinx community, it's 92%. When we look at the African-American community, it's 97 to 98%, which means it's very, very difficult for businesses led by people of color to scale. And scale is really where the opportunity lies for wealth creation, right? And so when we think about what it takes in order to scale, it comes down to a few things, right? Financial capital, because you have to be able to get ahead of the services and products. You have to be able to invest in it before you can kind of sell it out in the marketplace. And it takes a tremendous amount of profit margin for your business to be able to reinvest back in itself in a way that enables it to scale. So you need external financial capital. You need intellectual capital, because there's a lot about entrepreneurship that is not intuitive, and it's a very steep learning curve. And at every level, there's a new education that needs to happen. So that intellectual capital is really important. And then social capital is tremendously invaluable to an entrepreneur's ability to access the relationships that they need in order to scale their businesses, right? But when we think about how do we help people of color who are already disproportionately impacted as relates to all of these things to access it to the degree that they need to scale? It does not happen in a vacuum. It requires very intentional interventions in order to make that work. We need to be hyper strategic in moving the needle. And that's largely carried out by organizations that are at work on the ground, in the trenches, working with entrepreneurs, business owners, creatives, and other sorts of innovators, right? And so at Black Innovation Alliance, the organization that I have the privilege of leading, we are a national coalition of innovator support organizations that support startup founders, business owners, and creative technologists, working with things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and et cetera. So at BIA, our mission is really to create the sort of ecosystem that's necessary for Black innovators to thrive. We do this by supporting the organizations directly and finding all sorts of ways to direct resources and opportunities their way, because we believe that they operate as the front line of support for Black entrepreneurs and innovators. But we also are focused on bringing about systems change. So increasing connectivity across the stakeholders, updating the narrative about what it means to be a Black innovator in this moment, helping to set the agenda and leveraging thought leadership to build the field. And if you want to learn more about BIA, you can check out our website at blackinnovationalliance.com. But one question that we're really excited about at BIA is this conversation around digital entrepreneurship. We reached out to the Kauffman Foundation last year because we saw this trend where a lot of the resources were essentially being directed to programs supporting tech startups or programs supporting traditional small business. And that's really important, but when you talk to your average 12-year-old and you ask them what they want to be when they grow up, chances are most are going to tell you some form of a social media influencer, right? So there are all these ways that people are making money and trying to close their own personal and collective wealth gap online, and the industry doesn't really seem to be caught up in terms of providing the supports that they need to really kind of amplify online. And so Kauffman said, absolutely, and provided us some seed money to launch BladeCon, Black Liberation in the Digital Economy, where we were really focusing on this concept of digital entrepreneurship. It was really important for us to map it, to figure out what is the lay of the land, what is the landscape, what does it mean to be a digital entrepreneur, and essentially what are the key domains. So for us, digital entrepreneurship represents internet-based business strategies focused on individual and collective ownership and wealth creation. And we identified 8 domains, and I'll move through them very quickly because I want to leave space for the other presenters to share their pieces as well. But number one, the juggernaut is e-commerce, right? So it's the largest category of online business. It generates, retail e-commerce generates 4.28 trillion a year, trillion with a T, and B2B e-commerce 7.72 trillion a year, right? So then content creation is number 2. Back in the 90s, it started with web blogs. Today, it's everything from social media influencing to e-learning, right? App development, which includes technologists and tech founders who are actually building out the digital marketplace. Professional services, which is no longer about traditional mom and pops getting online. Especially in the last 3 years, we've seen all sorts of bespoke industries kind of pop up, from dog walking to professional listening, and a big boon in telehealth and mental health services being delivered and deployed online. Decentralized finance, which is building an entirely new financial system. Esports and gaming. Gaming as an industry generates more in revenue than domestic sports and movies combined. It's huge and growing. Publishing and media, which is like content creation on steroids. These are platforms that derive a lot of their revenue from sponsorship and other sorts of sponsored content. And then lastly, education, community development, and activism. That's our 8th, which has really exploded, especially in social media as movements have kind of taken over. And so from this research, we learned a lot. That there's a tremendous amount of intersectionality and bleed across these domains. Disparities persist, especially in spaces like gaming and esports, where you would expect there to be greater representation, but there is not. And where there is opportunity, there is likewise risk. And so one thing that we learned is that Black folks in particular are over-indexing as early adopters of cryptocurrency and the like, but those spaces are still highly deregulated and unregulated. And so we need to make sure that people of color are going into these spaces with their eyes wide open. We'll be releasing a report, blueprint, to come out of that BladeCon conference within the next few weeks. And so if you're interested in accessing that report, you can find it on our site. Thanks, Dr. Durr. I'll hand it back to you.
Sure. So since we're talking, we brought up the mention of measurement earlier, I'd like to kind of go back to measurement, especially since Kelly brought up some great data points to share about kind of some of the problems that she's trying to overcome and the landscape around the problems that she's trying to overcome. So are there any additional kind of data points or specific instances of measurement that you guys would like to talk to Dr. Traci or Henry as it relates to kind of the work that you're doing as well?
In talking about the state of broadband infrastructure on tribal lands, as I said, it's both limited and flawed, but there's new congressional investments that are going to be helping tribal nations as they work towards expanding broadband infrastructure. So it is important to remember, and I'll remind you that I said that Indian country is 574 sovereign federally recognized tribal nations on 334 reservations in 35 states with 100 million acres of land. And it's also important to remember that Native nations are sovereign governments and have government to government relationship with the United States. So this is not a racial relationship. This is a government to government relationship, hence the investment in tribal communities. And so the US is obligated because of treaties to the federal trust responsibility to tribes. So investment in infrastructure is key to meeting some of those obligations in the trust responsibility. We've talked about the tribal digital inequities. So let me talk a bit about the data. So in looking at data on tribal nation infrastructure and deployment, like I said, it's brief. All sources paint that bleak picture. Some overstate access due to the data collection methods and bias. There's several studies, as I mentioned, including AIPI's Tribal Technology Assessment, by which I was an author in 2019. I'll pop it in the chat in a bit. But we really don't need a study to know the inadequacies of broadband in tribal communities, and we've talked about that. So quantifying the stories we saw in 2020 and 2021 is kind of moot. It's really time to solve the problem now. So if we dig into what data does exist, there's a couple of studies, including the FCC's 14th annual report on broadband in 2021. And this is where I got the citation of the tribal land disparities. So that report says that 79.1% of the tribal population has access to broadband as it's defined by the FCC. But this statistic pales in comparison to urban areas in the US, which are at 98.8%, and general rural areas, which are at 82.7%. But if you disaggregate the data, only 67.3% of tribal lands in the lower 48 have broadband access. Those of us who are Westerners, we get it. We know when you drive outside of the city, it's not connected out there. But the way that the FCC collects this deployment data leads to an overstatement of coverage in tribal lands because they collect it from the carriers. So when the Verizons and the T-Mobiles and the AT&Ts and whomever reports data on what's called the Form 477, they report that an area is covered if one household is eligible. Doesn't mean they actually are covered, just means they are, if one household in a zip code is eligible, they consider that area covered. So you can see how that leads to an overstatement of coverage on tribal lands. So this drops down the actual estimated coverage as 46.5% of the population has actually access to broadband. That's kind of crazy. That's less than half. That's less than half. And the FCC found in 2019 that 25% of tribal lands don't even have options for wired connections at all. So if the best case scenario still speaks to a digital divide in Indian country, and of course our own research has found that as well. We certainly found the early adopter of technology. I mean, we've found that for years. In 2009, my first study on tribal broadband also found that we were early adopters. But what we're really finding is that we are mobile. We rely, 33% of our respondents in our study in 2019 said that we rely on cell phone service for home internet connection. And we saw that grow during 2020 and 21 with COVID. So, you know, as we know, those without access are referred to the digital divide, but we kind of expand that at AIPI in our tribal technology assessment to include barriers to internet availability, affordability, speed, access, quality of access, location of access. It's really divides. And a lot it's really moving into more of this discussion of equity, digital equity. We still call it the digital divide because it's descriptive, but we are moving towards a state of talking about how we gain digital equity. And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about here today. But, you know, these multiple divides are still, I want to note, I mean, I want to be careful to not like paint this bleak picture and say that that's definitive of Indian country, because it sure isn't. We find ways to get online. We are innovators. I guess I mean, anecdotally, I would argue we've survived as Indian people because we're innovators and because we're able to adapt to new situations. So we find ways to get online. We are very mobile populations. We move between the cities and our homelands a lot. That's why we have the digital. So that means that we're adopting these technologies as opposed to fixed systems. And some of the data that I've found is showing that we're the earliest adopters, and we were historically as well. But I think I will leave this to Henry, but arguably I have heard without data again that upwards of 70% of Native Americans have some kind of side hustle. So they're entrepreneurial, though we wouldn't call it that, as I said. Certainly, I think the use of platforms such as Instagram in building a customer base for selling products and arts and such, as opposed to a static website or anything like that, is pretty prevalent. I would love to see studies of that and to see how that's quantified, but that's just not out there. But so keep that in mind. We just don't have the studies on the internet. We don't have the studies on entrepreneurship. It's just not there. The other thing to remember too is there's several types of entrepreneurship in Indian country. There is individual entrepreneurship, but tribes are tribal nations are governments, but they are also business owners. That doesn't exist anywhere else in the country. So tribal enterprises also have, those are businesses. And tribal governments also do workforce development in terms of entrepreneurship for individuals. They support their businesses. So these are things to think about in terms of Indian country, how we really work differently than other communities. So finally, I do want to say that there's also some real hope working towards closing the digital divide. In the last last 2 years, there's obviously been a ton of legislation, and some of that is the start of a foundation to tribal lands digital infrastructure. Congress saw it, everybody saw what happened in Indian country. So we are looking at literally $2 billion being invested into Indian country for the tribal broadband connectivity program. But you have to understand, there's 574 nations applying for $2 billion. And their applications as of a month ago had already topped a whopping 5.8 billion. So not everybody's going to get connected with this money. We figure that folks will need $8 billion. We figure it'll be $8 billion. So to connect tribal lands. So anyway, I'll wrap up. I'm talking too long. We got all out of sync, but that's cool. So ping me if you have questions. We have tons of information. I've already popped some stuff in the chat, but we're going to solve this. It's just going to take some time.
Thank you. That was awesome. Henry, do you want to share as well a little bit also?
Yeah, sure. I'll share a little bit. And just to kind of add to the conversation as well, around data, let's talk about data. A lot of our digital companies, right, our unicorns are all based on a data model, right? And it's flawed. We don't get to see any of that. We don't get to see any of that money that they get from our data. And there's opportunities, I think that was mentioned, right? Now that we're in this space and we're talking about Web3 and people are interested in cryptocurrencies and blockchains, we have the ability to own our own data. And what's been going on at NMCC is creating a data and investment cooperative. We've been able to work with different technology companies to help us create a decentralized autonomous organization. Again, we're not just talking about cryptocurrencies, we're talking about bartership. We're talking about people and e-governance. And I think those are the types of exciting things that we could see in the future. It's a word, if you all haven't heard it, we're talking about the indigiverse, right? You've heard about the metaverse, yeah. We're talking about the indigenous digital universe that we're creating, and we're gonna base it off of our ecological systems around us, right? I mean, I just wanna bring that kind of hope because it's a really bleak picture. And, someone shared with me, like, I wish you all the best of luck, because if history tells, we're in for a pretty hard ride, but we're ready for it. I just want to share just a little background. I shared that I'm absentee Shawnee, and that's the tribe of Tecumseh, Leaping Panther, right? And his brother Tenskwatawa, the prophet. And they led the largest resistance against not only the US, but the British and the French and other warring tribes. And they were able to unite people by winning over their hearts and minds. And the only thing that messed that up was a communication error between him and his brother. So I always think, if Tecumseh had the internet, what would it be like? And I really talk about that, just in our courses, right? We're bringing in history, right? If we were able to unite as tribes and really get behind something and work together, what's possible for our nation? And it's not just going to impact us as Native people. It's going to impact the whole world, right? Because we have indigenous people all over. And I think people are craving that kind of reconnection to their true identities, So I think there is a lot to offer. I just also, wanted to share that we're not going to be able to do it alone. We don't operate in vacuums. Linear systems and the tried and true models of businesses are not going to work within this new century. And probably one of the most devastating things that's happening to us in the Southwest is climate change. That's really the big thing that we're seeing, is just kind of the lack of water. We also work with Native American farmers, and we're seeing this, of having lands and waters being encroached on, and really having tribes wanting to make sure that they could protect those natural resources. And again, digital technology can provide those opportunities, can help us. Give an example. We're working with an entrepreneur that's using bees and tracking the pollen from bees to see all of the different species that's within a 5-mile corridor. They could also see all of the toxic chemicals that are around in their water and around their land. So you could see the impact. What could be the future if we use that type of data? Well, we could make sure that endangered species can be protected, that this land can be protected, that we're doing some type of bioremediation. So there is a way that we can connect like artificial intelligence with indigenous intelligence. And that's, really why we're here, and I just want to share too, like there's this growing solidarity amongst indigenous people and other marginalized communities. And I'm just so grateful, Dr. Burton, that you shared what you all are doing, because we need to connect. We need to really, build these platforms together and see that we have a shared struggle and work together.
I love that. That's a great way to kind of end what you were saying, because I think really it's about taking, what each of us are kind of learning and even what's being done in the for-profit space and turning it back and really figuring out how we can use it in what we're doing to measure actual like needs within society, which there's plenty of, especially since COVID. So I just want to remind everyone we're coming up to the question kind of area of our talk. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask our panelists, please share those in the chat and we'll be kind of asking them in addition to just asking some questions as well. And so I just want to kick this off by asking, since it was brought up, obviously there's a lot of need in society. And obviously we talked about how during COVID, those needs were kind of exacerbated and the inequality that already existed was exacerbated. So how are your organizations, and we can start with you, Dr. Burton, how are your organizations kind of managing this increase in need, and how are you managing your capacity within your organization?
Thanks, Dr. Durr. So I would say that for our organizations, a couple of things in terms of how are they managing the need. We did a report at the end of last year called the Black Innovation Census. You can find it at blackinnovationcensus.com, where we inventoried Black-led innovator support organizations to have a better understanding of the model, the services, how they were spread across the country. And we found that they are just launching at a rapid clip. And I would imagine that this is the case across communities of color. These organizations are coming online because they see a need, but the challenge is that they're really not strong business models to help them be sustainable. And so they will invest their personal savings. It might last a couple of years. They'll do a few quality programs, and then they have to shutter the doors and find a real job because the industry cannot afford to pay them for the quality and the talent. And so we are seeing a tremendous amount of churn in this space, which means the onus is really on the power brokers to figure out how we incentivize people to stay in this work as ecosystem leaders. So that's the one piece in terms of what we're seeing, just the rise of these organizations, but also just folks trying to tinker with the business model. Many of these organizations, their models were based on in-person events, in-person accelerators, co-working spaces, and almost all of that's been shut down over the course of the last 3 years. So like other businesses, they've been having to pivot to figure out a way to support their communities via kind of online means. And so I would say those are the things that stick out the most.
And Dr. Morris or Henry, would you like to add anything to that question as well?
I'll just say that, the growth was, so we were, I guess, ready. We had just, in 2019, we had just released our tribal technology assessment in the fall. So this was a big broadband study. And so when COVID hit, 4 or 5 months later, it was a wall. We had so much interest because we had the only published study. And so that was, it was crazy. So at first I lost all my staff. They literally got pilfered away to other organizations, and I rebuilt the staff after that. And we are triple the size now. Because so we've had a lot of interest in funding, but so we're doing a lot more work than we were I think everybody's, I feel like I shouldn't even say that. Everybody's doing way more work with a lot less resources. We did get more resources, but we're still doing way more work at a much faster clip than I ever anticipated that we could. And I think the only thing that's been hard for us is the amount of folks coming into this space and having to work with tribes and you know, who's ethical and who's not. How do you talk to these organizations that may just be in it for the money, and then now, you know, who are the good ones, who, you know, who are the ones who've always been there? There's so many people and they follow the money, and with this congressional investment and all this infrastructure, I mean, that has been the crazy thing, keeping up with it all. Yeah, I think, but it's a good problem to have, and it's I think we grew more in these 2 years than I expected to do in 5.
Yeah, agreed. I think there was one point where we were talking about shutting our doors, and I also had a storefront business as well, working with Native youth and getting them on bicycles and having a pop-up shop, and we had to close as well. So really, you know, much love to the youth, because they, I want to say, got the most, you know, were most impacted by this past 2 years of just not being able to go outside and do regular things that young people do. But what we saw is that right when the pandemic hit, we knew that most of our vendors sold at powwows, at feast days, cash-based economies. So we created an online platform called Indigi Exchange, and we were able to buy products from our entrepreneurs and then help them co-market it. And in order to be on it, it's a work, learn, and earn opportunity. So give you cash right away, let's buy you. Have you ever done wholesale before? Well, let's talk through it. Let's have you determine a price, right? And get ready to work with other people. And then also, hey, you need a landing page. So we were able to work with Square, now Block, and they were able to provide free websites via Weebly for them. So that kind of process, that work, learn, and earn model, has evolved now into another app, a no-code app called IndigiWork, all based on Google Sheets. So again, we've evolved this, right? We're teaching people all about spreadsheets. You could turn this into an app now, right? Like, this is where technology's at. And that's an opportunity app. So what we decided is that rather than kind of use a traditional organizational structure where we're going to hire full-time people, we wanted to hire our gig economy, the same people that we're working with, to provide opportunities for them. Say, hey, can you help someone get online? Can you help someone with their social media? Can you provide wood to elders? Log it. We'll pay you for it, and you could earn tokens in that same economy. So that's kind of what I'm talking about with the Indigiverse, right? What are all of these different tools that we could use to just build a bigger community that's not just based off of transactions and money? And I think, you know, the biggest inspiration for us is actually coming out of Hawaii. I'll also share that because I'm also, you know, that's where my mom's family, that's where my mom lives. And they just have such a sophisticated sense to around all of this, around data sovereignty, governance, you know, just activism in general. So we've been able to build these solidarity, right, with people across the world to develop these ideas and products. So we're just happy to share that, like, we've been able to create this ecosystem with other innovative indigenous people, and it's really made an impact. And that's kind of where we're going again, is that we want to make sure that we spread the wealth. If we're getting any funds, we're bringing this in, we're making sure that we're training community members to be a part of it.
I love that. That's awesome. Thank you so much. That was an excellent answer. And you brought up a great point that I was actually going to talk about a little bit next as well, which is the ethical side of this discussion. Let's before we close out, let's kind of shed some light on the ethical constraints around your work and how you're kind of managing some of that now, obviously in a post-COVID society as well, where there's a lot more opportunities for people to be exploited or mistreated through this digital divide and how their data is potentially being used. So how are you individually kind of managing that within your organizations? And I'll start with you, Dr. Burton.
I'll actually punt because Henry and Traci might have something more substantive than I would say in terms of our top priorities, because we're supporting organizations, the ethical piece does not really register very often for us. It's more a down the road conversation. So I'll punt to Traci and Henry. Dr. Traci.
Okay, go for it. Dr. Traci, I'm sure you have some.
Yeah, we definitely have seen this. You know, I guess one piece of advice I've always adhered to is you dance with who brung you. So I definitely defer to those that are on my advisory council, my community advisory council on that, who work in the space. But that being said, we're in a university, so we do talk a lot about data sovereignty, and we're really moving into this. How do we protect our data? How do we teach tribes to protect their data? We're moving also, because we do digital stuff already, we're moving towards cybersecurity. In fact, we co-hosted a panel at a recent e-commerce event on cybersecurity for tribes. Of course, tribal enterprises such as gaming have been involved in this, in cybersecurity for years, but cybersecurity, though tribes won't talk about it, is very prevalent at the governance level. So we definitely, because we work with tribes specifically, we're working more in that era. And of course, data sovereignty. And Henry, I'm guessing you all are doing a lot with data sovereignty as well. So maybe you want to explain it.
Yeah.
You probably do it better than me.
Oh my God, no, I don't think I could do that. But that's been a huge topic for us, and really as a nonprofit too. Like, we're not a tribal entity, so there's questions that we have to talk about. Working with Native Americans around tribal sovereignty and even individual sovereignty too. That's really, again, going back to this idea, this concept that at the end of the day, our entrepreneurs are not just entrepreneurs, they're cultural bearers, right? So they're making pottery, they're weaving baskets, they're making traditional attire that has nothing to do with the market, all that to do with culture. So we need that to continue. And so we've been looking at, universal basic income, other ideas of like, how do we support these individuals to make sure that they could be happy and healthy in their ancestral homelands, in their communities. And so that goes back, to this idea of data sovereignty. That, like, how can we pay people? How can we give them a dividend? How can we lease their data from them? And that's really a pivot for us, because I think it does two things. It allows the individual to know that this is a reciprocal relationship. It's not charity, right? Like, you're contributing your data, you're contributing your insights, you're telling us what's going on, and we're able to create solutions. So we co-created that together. What is that worth? What's the value of that? And that's really difficult. And that's kind of the need that we're thinking about, is like, what does philanthropy, have to play in this? Other tribes, right? Because my tribe as well, like, this is nothing new, right? We have ways to support our tribal members through education, through, in some cases, leases that we have for land. So we could provide this model as another model to tribes, to say, hey, have you thought about a shared collective governance model around data or around big important decisions that's different than per cap? If you all haven't heard, something that's just, paid, distributed to the community. So that's a really big ethical question for us right now. It's like, who do we talk to, right? If we have, 50 different people from 50 different tribes, how does that work? How does that work to make sure that we're respecting tribal sovereignty as well as individual sovereignty? So these are big questions that we're still looking into answers for, but we like the idea of creating a data cooperative and investment cooperative, because really what we're doing is creating a shared safety net. And we've got to remember, 60% of Native Americans live off reservation, like myself included, right? So how do we recreate a nation? And Dr. Morris, I'm invoking history again, because this is what Tecumseh was talking about, that we share land in common with everyone, that this is our shared land and our shared history. So, just something.
But we have to protect our data.
Yeah,
we have to own our data as tribal nations. So that becomes a part of the ethical discussion.
I love it. And that's a great way to kind of end our panel. And I think we've ended on a very high note. So I just want to thank everyone who joined us today, and also thank our panelists, and thank the Kauffman Foundation for having us as well. I hope that you guys got a lot from this. Please connect with the panelists. They've shared resources within the chat, and you are welcome to connect with me as well on LinkedIn. I'm going to share my my address. Please friend request me if you are interested. And thank you, Anya, as well, for having us as well. So I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Thank you, Angel, and thank you, panel 2 presenters, and thank you, panel 1 presenters, and thanks everybody for engaging in this very meaningful and timely conversation. I also wanted to take this moment as an opportunity to announce our upcoming Spring Knowledge Challenge Showcase. It is scheduled for April 24th at 10 a.m. Central Time. At this event, the Knowledge Challenge grant recipients will share their research with the goal of providing practical, actionable, and rigorous insights to entrepreneurs, researchers, policymakers, ESOs, and community members. So registration link for this event and the past forum recordings is in the agenda document that was linked in the chat box. We will also be sharing more information about the upcoming forums and other events in our Insights to Entrepreneurship newsletter. So we also have a link for that in the chat box. Please click on it and sign up. And we hope to see you at our future events. And thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.